Okay, so good afternoon, Dr. John Dwyer.
Yeah.
So let's just go on with the interview, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the first question I'd like to ask is, how would you like to define climate change?
Yeah, so Earth's climate is always changing. It's important to note that Earth's climate has undergone dramatic changes in the past, but I think what you're referring to is what we call anthropogenic climate change, which is human-caused climate change, mostly due to carbon dioxide as well as other greenhouse gas emissions. And so when we talk about that, we usually talk about how those increase in these greenhouse gases affect the radiative balance of the atmosphere and cause temperature changes, precipitation changes, changes in lots of other fields of the Earth's climate.
Okay. You did mention that you're a believer of that it's global warming is caused by humans, right?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important to note that there's natural climate variability as well as this anthropogenic or human component to climate. So that even if humans weren't doing anything, the climate wouldn't be the same. There would be some periods where temperature would increase, some periods where temperature would decrease, some periods where it would fluctuate, as well as with other climate variables too. But we have entered a period where the human effect is adding on to this natural variability. So sometimes and this human effect is towards increasing greenhouse gases, which is increasing temperature. So when you add that on to this natural variability, there's going to be periods where you have increasing temperature, periods where temperature might not increase as much because you're adding on this increasing trend to more of like a time-varying variability component. Yeah.
Okay. So aside from like the carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, since we know that it's usually one of the main causes of global warming, do you think there are any other primary causes of global warming, especially in the US?
Yeah, well, I mean, so we talk about climate forcings, and these are things that can affect climate. So there's a few man-made ones that we're trying to understand better, and we think we have a fairly good grip on some of them, like carbon dioxide, methane gas, some other greenhouse gases. But then there's other things like CFCs, which affect ozone, and if you change ozone, that has an effect on climate. For example, the ozone hole that is now recovering because we've discontinued our use of aerosol cans that emit CFCs. So that's just an example of another component. Then there's also these natural components too. Volcanoes have a large effect. There is some solar variability that can affect climate too, but those are relatively small over the last 40 or 50 years compared to the trend of carbon dioxide especially. Sorry, can you remind me the rest of your question?
The other primary cause of global warming in the US.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so the climate forcings, some of them are global, right? Like we think of carbon dioxide as emitted from a particular location. I mean, carbon dioxide is emitted from many locations, but from some places more than others. But once it gets into the atmosphere, it mixes really well and it doesn't precipitate out. So we think of that as kind of having this global effect, mostly. Whereas you can think in some regions that emit a lot of pollution, so like the east coast of the United States, China, Western Europe to some degree. Those regions are emitting a lot of pollution, and that also actually affects the amount of sunlight that reaches the Earth's surface, as well as heating the atmosphere at different levels, and that can also have an effect on Earth's climate. So that's more of a local effect in in addition to the global greenhouse gas effects.
Okay. So you're a bit familiar with the Kyoto Protocol, right?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, so do you think that it could help the U.S. if the U.S. did go back into the Kyoto Protocol, and if it could actually be a big benefit towards the cause to stop global warming?
Yeah, I mean, well, so I guess I should clarify. My role is mostly as a scientist, so I feel like that's a little bit of a policy question to answer. I don't know the precise details of the agreement and whether it would have made sense for the U.S. to sign. But that being said, I do believe that to limit greenhouse gases, there needs to be a coordinated international accord or some sort of agreement that that everyone abides by, because this is a global problem, right? You can't just solve it in one place. You know, for example, you know, I don't really know a lot about economics, but I know that if you have strict regulations in one place about carbon dioxide, then that's going to shift activity to somewhere else. So it needs to be addressed globally, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay, so next thing I'm going to ask is, do you think global warming has now fallen to a category of more scientific or political issue, according to you?
Yeah, well, so I guess, so the question is whether you think the reason there's no action on global warming is because of science or because of politics? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, because like these days politicians tend to classify global warming. I mean, there's Republicans, there's Democrats, and each of them are asked to have their own standing in global warming.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the science is pretty much there on that humans are having an effect on temperature in particular, and other climate variables too. You know, we're very confident of that. As to certain questions, like for example, how much global mean surface temperature warming would you get if you double the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? That we don't have a precise answer to, in that we can't say that it will warm the atmosphere or the Earth's surface by exactly this many degrees. The best we can do is a range right now, and that range is usually given around 2 to 4 degrees Celsius for a doubling of CO2, for example. So yeah, right. So the science, I mean, the science is sure enough that we know what's coming if we continue to do this. So I think it's more of a policy or political question at this point, and it takes the political will to enact some of this action, just to stop the emission of CO2 or slow it down.
So according to you, like at this current moment, how real of a threat is global warming towards us as we are living?
Yeah, it's very real. It's already having effects, for sure. I mean, the sea level is higher now than it was 100 years ago. You know, I think around 8 inches globally or so, or something around that number. So that means, you know, any storm that causes flooding, there's an extra 8 inches there that wouldn't have been there without global warming. That number is going to continue to rise. So that's already an effect that we're seeing. So it's already real, and we know it's going to become larger. You know, I think it's important to think about that. You know, we're very adjusted to the current climate state. You know, we've built cities and around certain expectations of how the climate will be. So whenever there's any change to that, that's going to have big effects.
Do you think it would be strange to find how the climate actually behaves?
Sorry, what was that?
Do you think it would be strange to find how the climate actually behaves? Because climate is ever changing, right?
Uh-huh. Well, yeah, but I mean, you can characterize the climate by a certain like mean state, and you can clarify what the natural variability is. So I think there are definitely measures of natural climate, that we know to some degree, and of course, as you mentioned, the climate has changed in the past, and that's a very active research area to understand past climate changes. Paleoclimate, for example, is taking measurements of past climate through ice cores, for example, and trying to understand what caused those changes.
So we know that there are a lot of people who try to debate against climate change happening, and that they think that global warming is not caused by humans. For example, like Richard Linson, who mentioned previously that he thought that global warming was something of a cult. What do you think about this statement?
That opinion isn't shared by most scientists. Most of the experts, or nearly all of the experts, agree that we're seeing and we will continue to see changes in the Earth's climate that are due to human effects, specifically greenhouse gases.
After all, the scientific consensus does stand mostly on the fact that humans do cause global warming, right?
Yeah, I mean, we understand it from a pretty basic physical understanding of radiative transfer, and we have run computer simulations, models that do a very good job of simulating current climate, though not perfectly. And from those and our physical understanding, as well as observations of over the last 100 years or so, we have a pretty good understanding of why the climate is changing.
So personally, do you think the climate change is affecting your and MIT's operations here, like in Boston itself so far?
I think MIT is very aware of the climate issue. For example, over the last 12 months or so, they've been having this climate change conversation on campus. So they've been, it's been very much on the minds of people here. So for example, one of the things they talked about was whether the university should divest from fossil fuel companies. So they're definitely aware of it and treat it seriously, I think.
So do you think there will be a bigger, more significant impact in the next few years, maybe 10, 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, we're emitting greenhouse gas. We're continuing to emit greenhouse gases, and as we do that, the temperature will continue to rise. So, so I expect that to continue unless we begin to limit our emissions or stop our emissions.
So, you're probably aware that companies these days, there's a lot of companies that spend millions of dollars on trying to stop global warming, but we see that global warming isn't really coming to a halt, and that there are many people still unable to actually make a decision where to stop it, or they just don't care. So do you think that all these dollars spent are actually making a change within our Earth?
Well, so you're talking about, for example, like a company that manufactures solar panels, or if someone switches from coal to solar. I mean, in that sense, those are greenhouse gas emissions that don't go into the atmosphere, right? So that's that's warming that didn't occur. Though I suppose the coal, for example, would still be there underground and could be burned at some point in the future, theoretically. But I mean, these are all, and people take individual actions too. If you ride your bike instead of driving, for example, these are individual or organizational ways that people are limiting their carbon footprint. But that being said, I think there's there is a need for an international sort of agreement on this, because that's the only way to truly make a big dent in greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah. So actually, one of the other things is that you're familiar with the cap and trade, right?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that it has affected how people think in a way about global warming, or has it really done much?
I guess I don't really know enough about that to comment on. My research is mostly on the science rather than the economics of that.
Okay. And do you think that there's many speculations that global warming has done many things to cold places like Antarctica and many other ice glacier places? So one belief is that it could bring back the ice age. Do you think that is true?
I don't see how that would happen. With global warming, we would expect ice to melt as part because the atmosphere is warmer and the Earth's surface is warmer. So that would be going the opposite direction from the ice age. Yeah.
So compared to other world issues such as economics and wars, we do sometimes start to see that global warming slowly slips down onto the bottom of the list. Why do you think this is so?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a little bit of a human psychology sort of question, but I'll take a stab at it just because I do think it's a problem that won't have a direct impact on your life tomorrow, right? I mean, if there's a war going on, right, in the country next to you or in your country, that's going to have a huge effect on your daily life, as well as the decisions that are important for your country to make. This is the sort of thing that's, global warming's impacts are already being felt, but the real dangerous impact is down the road. And I think that it's hard to look at that and to address such a big question now, because it's things don't usually happen until, it seems like things don't happen until they're forced to happen, and there's nothing that's forcing us to make to do something about global warming now, if you know what I mean. It's like more of an issue that we understand, we know what the impacts are within some range, but they're not affecting us now in the way that we expect them to be in the future. So it's hard to plan for that. We're not very good at planning, I guess. Is another way of putting it.
So, these days, many scientists, many people have come up with creative plans to stop global warming, like, for example, like using more solar panels and introducing new technology and reducing the emission of other greenhouse gases. But personally, what do you think is the best methods to stop global warming currently, and what should people actually do and focus more on?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's not something I'm entirely familiar with because I'm more working on the science of global warming, but I think it's important to explore all of these technologies. Solar panels seem especially promising, continuing to develop them and bring the cost of them down. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the last question.
Okay.
Okay. So, we know that every time we tell people to actually stop global warming, many people still don't see the seriousness of this case. And even though we know, every person we tell, there's one popular case is that we always tell them, that you should care for your grandchildren when the next generation comes. And I think that most people have collectively said, let's just enjoy now and just leave it for that era to come. But And another research also said 1 in 4 Americans are skeptical towards global warming. So with all these answers combined, like how would you personally convince someone to act against global warming and to be able to support the movement to believe?
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of gets to one of your earlier questions too. If we understand, what the effects of global warming will be, why aren't we doing anything right now about it?
Yeah.
But I guess this is more on a personal level. How would you convince someone to do something? And I mean, I think what you said at first, to make an argument for their children or their grandchildren, is a good one. It's hard. And some people are, you can imagine if someone's in a situation where they don't have very good economic prospects. For example, if they're living in an area that's depressed economically, it's hard to tell them to talk about global warming because there's more pressing concerns for them, more immediate concerns. Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to require action by leaders, yeah, I mean, I don't know, as a scientist, I'm not entirely sure, what the best way to go about it is, but the best that I can do is to keep talking about the science and trying to understand that better, and that's my part of this, to try to, that number I gave you earlier, if we double carbon dioxide, we expect around 2 to 4 degrees Celsius of global warming. I want to decrease the range on that number so we can have a better understanding of exactly what the effects are. So I think that will help things too if we can reduce that range, but it might not be the case that we can ever say it will be exactly this much warming with this much CO2. And in that case, it's just, I mean, I guess it's up to people to convince others, that this is an important problem.
Okay. So yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're
Dr. John
welcome.
Dwyer.
Yeah, I hope that